Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is morning here, at least for me. Up here in the Bronx, your lovely Miss Burns coming at you. I'm sure you miss this voice a whole lot. So I know many of us often used to like to come to my little test reviews, so I thought, hey, why not make you guys a little review video? Maybe you'd appreciate that. So, just some things to focus on. Listen, tomorrow for Friday's quiz, it's a quiz, right? It's going to be a half hour. There will be a short answer question on there, followed by some multiple choice, right? But I try to simplify it because I know we're not in a normal classroom setting. Normally, I'd be giving you guys a much larger exam, but I'm really trying to condense it and make sure you guys just really know some key details and information here. So, if you hear banging in the background, I apologize. They're building a new building across from me, so hopefully it's a nice building. As long as it doesn't block my sunlight, I'm good. All right. Why the golden ages of the Tang dynasty began. So you should gather this from the handouts that you guys had done, right? But why we call the Tang post-classical civilizations, right? Because when we look at the word classical, right, we're talking about the Han Dynasty from ancient China, and then we're also talking about the ones that existed in Europe too. Civilizations like the ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Like those are all classical civilizations. So post-classical means after the time of classical civilizations. Now, China was different than, let's say, what happened in Rome, right? Rome, the empire divided, right, and never reunified like how it did. But in China, it had reunified, right? It had reunified under the Sui dynasty, S-U-I. Okay, so it was the first dynasty to reunify China after some years of being fragmented or not unified. Okay. So that's one important detail I want you to know as far as we're talking about the introduction to the Golden Ages. Now, what was the role of women in the Tang and Song dynasties? Okay, I would argue that women underneath the Tang dynasty enjoyed more freedoms, positions of power, respected, just that in general, in a higher status, more freedom than they did during the Song dynasty. The Song dynasty, women were able to still do some things like, for example, inherit property. And they did still receive an education because they thought that if women were educated well, then they'd raise their sons to also be educated well. But also during the Song dynasty, that's when we see the introduction of foot binding, which kept women in the home. So we would consider that like an example of women being subjugated or oppressed, put down during the Song dynasty. So that's an area I would say where women were not treated so fairly. Okay, but they were educated in both dynasties. And like I said, women had a bit more freedom during the Tang dynasty. Now, these are golden age dynasties, right? So golden age means a lot of wealth, right? Prosperity, stability, and new achievements. During the Tang and Song dynasties, we saw many new inventions that were created. You should gather that from your research and from the handouts. The biggest ones were printing, right? So they had already had woodblock printing, but with this new type of printing called movable type. Instead of having an entire woodblock carved into, you would have just one Chinese character, and those characters could kind of be moved around on a plate and inked however they were liked. But the big impact of printing is that it allowed for the spread of information more easily because it was cheap, right? We know paper came out of China, right? So they had paper, they could print multiple copies of things. This allowed the general populace to become more literate. It also really helped those studying for those civil service exams, which we're going to get to in a little bit, right? For the civil service exams, one of the big things that emphasized was poetry, study of literature, writing, philosophy. Okay, those people studying for those exams needed access, easy access, cheap access, right, to printed materials of people who have done it well in the past. So in general, it just created a more educated society, allowed people excel on civil service exams, and created better works of poetry and literature, all because of new printing technologies. There are art during the Tang and Song dynasties both focused on nature, right? So if you look at their poetry, a lot of the time it focused on nature. If you look at their paintings, right, a lot of the time there are these beautiful landscape paintings, big emphasis on nature in their making of art. Other achievements, okay, even though this came from Vietnam, this new type of fast ripening rice had a great impact on China. China had a growing population. The introduction of this rice made their population grow even greater. But the fact that you had this steady food supply also helped create a more stable society. Last big one there is iron. And really, I'm focusing on iron during the Song dynasty. Okay, the Song dynasty experienced what we call industrial age, centuries prior to Britain having experiencing theirs, during the 18th, 19th centuries, to the point where during the Song dynasty they were mass producing iron basically just as much as what Britain had centuries later, which is really impressive. So they were using that iron to make armor, to cast different weapons, things of that nature. And yeah, those are the big ones. Civil service exams. All right, our next bullet point there. So these exams, what it did in Chinese society is you could be a poor person, right? And then you could take this exam and you could better yourself in life, right? You could better your lot, and provide better opportunities, not even just for yourself, but, also for your family. So what they did is they allowed for greater social mobility, right, and opportunities, right, to become more wealthy. So people would study for these exams. Again, I already mentioned the focus on poetry and literature because they test those types of reasoning skills that were highly valued amongst the Chinese in their government. Some important terms that I want you to kind of focus in on, all right? So we have Neo-Confucianism, okay? In China, during the Tang and Song dynasties, we see a few new philosophies, or not new philosophies, but philosophies that began to evolve, okay? And they evolved because you had a lot more different types of people coming into China, right? Like you have the idea of Buddhism, which spread along the Silk Road, came originally from India into China, and as it mixes with other Chinese philosophies, different things are going to happen. Like how when we talked about Islam, right, and when it spread to different places, how Islam evolved. So Neo-Confucianism is that blend of Confucian ideas with some of those other philosophies, like Taoism and Buddhism. And stresses more like the individual approach, but still kept a lot of those classical Confucian ideas like respect for parents, filial piety, things of that nature. This is a fun word to say. I don't know if anyone's tried to say that themselves. Okay, bodhisattvas. Basically, they're just a fancy way of saying people who were considered enlightened, and instead of being, in the belief in Buddhism that you reach a stage of enlightenment and you achieve nirvana, and that's it. That's like the highest point you could be at. Instead, these people basically get reincarnated back and are supposed to kind of be the leaders for people within Chinese society. Zen Buddhism. Okay, so really the focus of Zen Buddhism is really the focus on just meditation, right, as the best way to finding any type of enlightenment. And that's why, like, if you ever see those little Zen gardens, I had some pictures in the PowerPoint, right, where you see people Basically, what they'll do is they'll be in a Zen garden, they'll go and there'll be rocks placed in different areas, or maybe they'll groom the Zen garden, and just the practice of that in itself is like a form of meditation. The tribute system, okay, is nothing to do with any type of these philosophies here or religious beliefs. The tribute system was basically this, okay, what it was in theory versus reality, which is important. The Chinese always thought themselves, right, they were ethnocentric, right? And we've talked about this phrase before, thinking that your ethnicity is more superior than others, right? And for many reasons. I mean, the Chinese did come to invent many of the technologies, that the Europeans didn't figure out till much later, right? So they were ahead of the game for a long period of time. So because they had this belief, they felt like anyone who was not Chinese, right, who was a foreigner, would have to pay tribute. So if you want to come into China, if you want to get in and have permission to come in, you have to bow, you have to bring gifts, right, in order to please, right, the Chinese rulers, and then they'd let you in. But in reality, what really was the issue was the Xiongnu, or what we'll be talking about more next week, the Mongols, right? In order for these nomadic peoples to stop attacking China, right? They were basically giving gifts, so they wouldn't attack them, right? So it was kind of like bribing them. And we've talked about this before earlier in the year. Moving forward. So, what impact did China have on other places? Okay, Korea and Vietnam were tributary states of China, meaning that they would have to pay taxes, and basically China had some type of control, but at the same time they did have a bit of autonomy or freedom themselves. Yes and no. Okay, because China did force a lot of its beliefs on Vietnam and Korea. They did not really have a choice, or another term we'll talk more about next week, selectively borrow. Okay, they weren't able to choose what parts of Chinese culture they wanted to adopt. It was kind of forced upon them. So whether it be religious beliefs, whether it be language, whether it be the way they dressed or their style of government, it was basically forced upon these two places. And it's because China was more powerful. Okay, they had more power. Lastly, comparing the Tang and Song with the Abbasid dynasty, right? So I'm giving you a little hint right here, okay? This is smelling like an SAQ, I'm just saying. So go back to your comparison charts. If you felt like yours was not strong, please make sure you're looking at my key. When we compare, by the way, just to reiterate something here, okay? When you're comparing ideas, right? If I said two similarities and two differences between the Tang and the Song versus the Abbasid, okay? When you compare or contrast, you should be focused on one category, right? So if I'm comparing, right, the Tang and the Abbasid, right, or these dynasties with Abbasid, right, like the thing that I compare across, right, I'm saying that they are similar because, like, it should come across in the same category, right, prosperity and stability, right? Or if I'm comparing and trying to make a comparison with the arts, right, I'm saying, well, during the Tang and Song dynasties, they focused on nature, they were influenced by Buddhism and Taoism or Taoism, whereas in Islam is focused on geometric patterns. Like, that's a comparison. But saying something like, you know, the Abbasid did geometric patterns, and during the Tang dynasty, you know, they focused on printing, right? We're not comparing, sorry, I just realized I was cut off. We're not comparing across the same category, right? That's not an equal comparison, right? So a comparison, saying something similar or different, you're comparing across the same category, okay? All right, hopefully that was helpful. And if you've got any questions, please make sure you reach out to me. The quiz, I know the PowerPoint had some stuff about Japan. If you notice, this week's readings were about samurai and knights. Next week we're going to talk about Japan and the Mongols, so I'm not really focused on that for our quiz this week. Okay, like when I give you guys a little end of the week quiz next week, they'll focus on the Mongols and on Japan. All right, bye guys.